Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Ethical Perspectives. My name is Beth Parker, and our topic this evening is marginalized populations. And as I researched this topic, I realized the levels of complexity. I think we've all been on both sides. We've been marginalized and we've been privileged. But before we get started, I'd like to invite our panelists to introduce themselves, and we won't talk about your projects just yet, but tell us who you are and why this topic is of interest to you.
I guess I'll jump in.
Okay.
I'm Leslie Wright. I work with United Way.
Thank you for joining us. Yep.
This topic is of interest because the work of United Way is to look at where are there disparities in our community and what can we do about them, so that everyone has a chance to live a good life. In order to do that, we need to understand how that comes to be in our community. What are the structures? What are the practices that create that? So
Okay, that sounds good, and we'll talk about some of your programs as we proceed.
I'll go next. Maurice Davis, Power Program Manager at Jane Boyd. I would say this topic is important because Jane Boyd functions as kind of the meeting place for a group of people that you maybe consider marginalized or underserved. And so, on the other side of getting a chance to interact with families, that this topic is specifically kind of umbrellaing. I'm interested to see how the conversation unfolds.
Hi.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
No, thanks for coming.
I'm Keesha Burke-Henderson, Director of Diversity and International Student Success at Mount Mercy University. And this topic is of interest because really this is my area of study and interest in general, but specifically at Mount Mercy, I work with our students of color in a predominantly white institution, and also our international students, again, which is a very small population within the whole. And so, whenever we're talking about marginalization, we have to think about it in terms of who's in the center as well, right? And so people are only considered marginalized in relation to the population that makes up the center. So in working with those populations, I think that's what puts me here to talk about that.
Thank you. And to your point, I had a question about marginalization. How do we define that? Is it a demographic? Is it typically always people of color? Because I think that all of us have been in a position where we have been marginalized and we have also been people of privilege. So let's try to define that marginalization a little more. Who and why who is the marginalized population?
Well, don't quote me, but the definition is something like a group of individuals that are restricted from mainstream activities, economic, political, or social. And so to kind of hit on your point, is it always people of color? I'd say no. Depending on where you are, you would be the majority. And so, your color might not be the reason, but there are other things that can classify you and kind of put you in that marginalized category. Religion, your sexual orientation, all those categories that we subdivide ourselves into.
Like labels or?
Yeah, I could say we could say labels.
Yeah. So before I came over here, I was having dinner and listening to three very young people talking about physical fitness centers where they would go to work out, and they mentioned one place and they said, and I won't mention names, they said, when you see that place, don't you just think of old people? So I do think it is tied to labels, but it's also tied to the ability to choose. So whenever a group of people is placed in a position where their choices and options are shaped or confined by other people, to me, that's marginalization.
Keesha, you want to feed in or
Yeah,
not necessarily?
so, you know, the Bell Hooks wrote her book From Margin to Center back in, you know, the 80s, and she talked about I think the opening part, she says that the margins are defined by the whole. And so looking at what is the whole, and then how does a group or people fit within that whole. And so being able, I think, to understand that when we talk about marginalization, it gets, I think, really tricky because we're talking about power, essentially, right?
Agreed.
And so if we're talking about power, then we're talking about who holds what power at any given moment. And so that's always
And how is it
a
leveraged,
give and
maybe?
take.
And how is it leveraged, maybe?
And how is it leveraged? Who is it leveraged to and for? Because again, we can't talk about marginalization without talking about policy, right? So policy is something that keeps people, right, in their margins, whatever that might be, that defined line. And so the definition, I think, is it could be varied, you know, depending on, you know, how we look at it. I definitely think it's more complex even than just a simple line.
Sure.
It certainly is layered in how we talk about power and who gets to shift and leverage power at any given moment, right? Because marginalization happens too. It's not something of the people.
Yeah. And were you going to add something, Leslie, or not necessarily? Yeah, so that was kind of what I was alluding to in the beginning when I said it, you know, it tends to get complex. And so there is that element of, you know, the people who have the power to leverage and to control or channel the marginalized group. So for a minute, let's just talk about your specific areas of expertise and your programs, and maybe specifically some of the programs that you offer for marginalized people. And then we'll go on to something else. Leslie, I know United Way has a ton of programs that.
Well, and primarily we fund programs like Jane Boyd and the work that they do. But over the years, we have used data to focus what we fund and how we work so that we are clearly addressing the needs of, in the context of this conversation, would be the most likely to be marginalized in our community. But we also produce things like condition reports in the hopes that we can open the community's eyes to what goes into creating those situations. There are lots of assumptions about how people end up on the margins. Part of our work is to help people understand that, again, it's complex, but in short, how people end up on the margins is as much about history and institutions and policies as it is about individuals and choices.
And that kind of took us to a conversation about Birth of a White Nation. And I mean, that's kind of what the author is alluding to there.
Yeah.
It's a construct. The concept of race in America is a construct. And it started a whole evolution of practices that result in marginalization of a certain race in this case. Is that your observation?
Oh, absolutely. And so much of what happens in community started a long time ago. So even our ideas about what will help people be well and thrive need to be put on under the microscope as well. Because sometimes what we think of as solutions are actually the things that make it worse, hold people back. So that's part of our work as well, is to understand, so what do solutions look like? And then for a very old traditional organization, how do we engage with community in different ways so that we don't, frankly, live
things
out,
worse.
live out the history of power that some longtime institutions have.
So Maurice, I know that you were kind of picking up on that. We had in a conversation that we had about what are the solutions or what are some of the resolutions. So you can either speak on your program and some of the specifics of your program, or maybe respond to Leslie talking about how we fix the problem. Fix it, Maurice.
So I'm not bold enough to think that I have the answer.
No, I was kidding. It's complex.
It is complex. I'll do a little bit of both. I'll speak about my program and speak about the solution. So Dr. Claude Anderson talks about in one of his books, I don't remember which one, that you can't have like social equality without economic equality. And so in that vein, my program looks to address the economic inequality across underserved demographics so we can help them remove barriers. And oftentimes we find that barriers aren't things like, I'm not getting the bid because I'm black. It could be as simple as, I may not have been in a family that was an entrepreneurial family, and I'm stepping out on a venture and I don't understand the complexities of what I'm about to step into. And so I step out on faith, but not understanding that stepping out on faith may incur fines, that someone that was raised in an entrepreneurial family, and whether that started because of the color of your skin or not, while your parents didn't get there, it still doesn't change the fact that you have some generational knowledge that you're lacking.
Absolutely.
That would have made that process easier for you to avoid that issue now that causes your business to fail. And so those are the things that we really look to improve upon, is helping aggregate knowledge resources so we can avoid those type of headaches so that people can be economically successful.
Yeah, that's a big bite. That's from what I know about Empower, there are lots of holes that you have to fill, because somebody may go through your program and think, I'm ready, but there is comprehensive or background supporting information, or help me out here, just supporting information, I'll leave it at that they don't have that.
Yeah, absolutely. Our program is only 11 weeks. There's no way I can teach you everything you need to know to run a business in 11 weeks.
Yeah.
And so what I really look to do is teach you what you don't know, and help you understand that there's a lot I don't know, and so that there are areas that I should be careful in, and understand that I have a resource, whether it be myself, SBDC, or whatever other programs out there, to say, maybe this is a moment to pause and to seek counsel or advice about what is the next step, so that I can avoid these problems that are inherent in kind of especially the regulatory realm.
And that also, if I could just add on to that, one of the things that became obvious to me moving here 17 years ago is the power of networks in this community.
Absolutely.
And so if you aren't connected, that can be a real challenge. Or if you step on the wrong thing, and that's a privilege. You talk about different kinds of privilege. So being not from here, just even that can be a barrier to someone being successful and exploring business opportunities, work opportunities, all of those things.
Definitely. I would honestly say the greatest power of going through our program is the website's great, the knowledge that I give is great. To be honest, it's nothing even that special. If you Googled it or YouTubed it, you probably could find someone that actually could deliver it much better than I can.
Keep your job, Maurice.
Transparency. But what I do well is I help connect you to people that you may not have been able to connect yourself to. And so it's the power of the network that we create, so we can build a community inside the community. So I can help you find those things that you need that otherwise would take you forever to uncover, or you might not be able to be honest.
Keesha,
we probably do similar things in higher education, because there's a few things that are at play, which is, on the one hand, say you'll have a first generation student, right, who may present as, economically on the lower scale of our social stratum, whatever that might be. And so there's things that need to happen, there are resources that they would need to have, and gaps that we need to fill for that student. But that is very much from the institution and from the structure to ensure that we have resources to help close the gaps of knowledge, know-how, internal or natural networks is what we call, ability to gain information that is a privilege for some folks in the right position because they have years of knowledge feeding through their families. But then the other thing that needs to happen is that we also need to speak to how people are empowered and how do they use what they already have. Mm-hmm. So there's a couple of things that go on there that I always think about when I think about marginalization, because there's the, I guess the idea here that there's some weakness about the margin. Mm-hmm. And, again, if I could refer back to Bell Hooks, she talks about, there's also power on the margins. There's things that are inherent, that are in the margins that, helps you to live daily, mm-hmm. right? That strengthens you, that gives you foresight, insight, fortitude, and all of those things. And, I would hate to make it seem like people are not empowered because they are,
marginalized.
The word marginalized
exactly
takes away their own ability and faculties to determine or self-determine.
Yeah.
And so a big part of what I think we have to do in higher education and our responsibility, especially people who are in my role, is to make sure that those populations that normally they considered as diverse, which that word does not do justice, right? But people who aren't considered part of the center know that they have the power just as much as what they would consider to be the center, and that we can flatten some of these hegemonic structures that continue to tell us that that the structure is this way, but actually it's not. If we think about margin and center, we're thinking about an entire circle of people and things, mm-hmm. right? Which sort of flattens that hegemonic structure. And then, looking beyond the margins, like where are you now, but maybe you don't even want to be in that circle and you want to create a different circle mm-hmm. over there. And the fact that you can be creative in thinking about how do I do that. So, marginality is, I struggle with it a little bit in the way that we talk about it.
And maybe
right?
that's why it's so hard to resolve, So let me just put forth an idea here in this book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, Dr. Joy DeGruy. Anybody familiar with that book?
Yes.
And so one little part that I remember, it's just profound, but one little part I remember was Dr. DeGruy went to Africa with colleagues, her sister. She was born in America, of course, but one of the things that sticks in my mind was a particular episode where they were having a meeting, and she was so worried because she was going to be late to the meeting. She was so worried. And she got to the meeting, and, as it turned out, there were several other people that were late, but they were African women. But when they were late, they stopped the whole meeting, and they didn't say, "Oh, well, Keesha, you're late." But they waited for Keesha to explain why she was late and how the children were, and then the meeting went on. And so in America, we would say, oh, they never get anything done. Mm. But in Africa, they would say, well, we have time for all of that, and we can do that too. So I think part of it may be in talking about, the problem is it's embarrassing almost to say, well, we want to help those people, because I am that person too. And so I want to come back to Maurice, because we were talking about the whole concept of fish or teaching to fish or, So, how do we recognize that power and stay out of the way and yet offer support?
That's putting the feet to fire today.
Yeah.
That's a great question. It's something that we struggle with all the time in our program. Is how much help how much help am I giving you that's creating a crutch? Because I never want it to be that I'm so in my client's business, and when I say business, I mean literally in their business, that I'm running components, and then when I step out, they can't do it themselves. And so when I think about the subject as a whole is how do we help people when they're in chaotic states and get them to a level of stability, but then from there teach them and help them gain the skills they need in order to then continue forward. I don't know.
It's an evolution. I mean,
I'm sorry to
No,
interrupt. Part of it to me is also making sure that we enter into working with people and preserving their dignity and addressing first things first. Because also from looking at the human service sector as a whole, oftentimes we segment people, and I'll talk about mental health, but much of mental ill health comes from depression and anxiety, the struggles of everyday life. I don't have enough food, I don't know where I'm going to sleep, I don't know how I'm going to care for my kids. And sometimes what we do is we diagnose that and we serve that, but we forget that if we assist with food and if we help to stabilize housing, that perhaps mental distress will ease, right? And it's not to suggest that mental illness, ill health isn't a real thing,
Right.
but it is a normal human experience. So I also think we have belief systems and mythologies that we bring into all of this as soon as we've decided that someone is marginalized or other than us. We have stories about why that's true. And whereas, if I have 18 things happening and 2 jobs and challenges with kids, I also may have more resources. Again, it goes back to those networks. So I can turn to others or I can pay for help. And then somehow my mental distress is interpreted differently, right? And so it's that too for me. How do we remember what is normal about human experience, and how do we offer everyone that same dignity or grace in that? I don't know if that gets to it, but.
So on a personal level then, not so much professionally, but personally, what kind of commitment or what kind of ideas do you have as a person that will allow you to accomplish these goals? So if I use an example myself, I drive for transportation for Cedar Rapids schools, and I cannot believe the impatience of people. I always got to beat the bus, and they've always got to. So one of the things that I try to do in learning to listen to other people is just to slow down and wait, and maybe let them go ahead and calm my own nerves. That's a personal practice that I can try to put into play to recognize the needs of others rather than to impose my will. And that's the difference that I'm trying to distinguish, as a marginalized person or as a privileged person. Are there personal things that you can think of that you can implement or utilize?
I'd say absolutely. To get back to what Leslie was saying, sometimes we forget about the human experience.
Yes.
You'd be surprised how impactful a smile can be. And I know that sounds like it's really cheesy, but
I don't think so.
One of the things that I try really hard to do, I'm successful some days, not as much the others, but like when I'm checking out at the grocery store, and the cashier says, have a great day, I attempt to use their name.
Yes.
Have a great day, Kevin. I appreciate your service today.
Absolutely.
Those type of things, there's that acknowledgement.
Yes.
Just watch a person's face. When you address them by name, it changes how they stand.
That you paid attention to them long enough
Absolutely.
to. I didn't mean to interrupt. I just got excited.
No,
Go ahead.
absolutely. Just and I talk about. I tell people all the time, I'm out here trying to change the world, And I mean that as I say it in a grandiose statement, but really and truly I look to how can I impact one person's day today? And if I can impact one person's day today, then, in effect, I've had an effect on the entire world. And, how many people now are having a better day because this one person was smiling.
Why is that cheesy, though? I think it's great.
Yeah.
I think it's critical. Keesha, what were you going to say?
No, I agree. And that same sort of approach is what is, I believe, is necessary, is the humanization of this whole, who gets valued versus who doesn't get valued. And, the thing is that we've got to, I want to change the world. That's how I wake up in the morning. That's how I go to work every day. And I think about, what is it that I can do today, right here, right now, with whatever it is that I have, that will impact, one student. And hopefully, I always try to have a goal of 3 touches, during the day that I stop and listen, ask a question, and hopefully, be able to offer something that may either switch on a light or, make them have less doubt or increase confidence somehow, or pass on a nugget of information that they may not have gotten otherwise, right? So I try to, as much as I can, be informed so that I can pass that on. So I think that is really powerful, and try to extend that to them as well, which is, gain as much information as you can, because at that point you'll be able to, use it for good and for yourself.
And so to that point, there's another book, The Tyranny of Experts, and the author talks about the rights of marginalized people, the rights of them or us in that position. And so it's so easy to overlook, again, thinking, well, I have something to offer you and I'm going to show you how it needs to be done, but what are your rights and what are you telling me as a person who may be considered marginalized? So we're kind of running out of time. Let me just give everybody a chance to say what's important about this, or what you would like the audience to take away, or what you've learned, or what you'd like to share.
I think listening to the conversation, for me, it goes back to being curious about people versus believing that you know the answer. That's what I hope to work on.
Got about 30 seconds each. So.
Yeah, make it quick. Just be nice to folks. You don't know what they're going through. Might change their day.
Thank you, Maurice. Keesha.
I think we have a responsibility to, shift some of the structures that exist. I think we definitely have a responsibility to ask more of the systems that are in place, while at the very same time honoring people in terms of what their capacity is.
Well, that's all the time we have. I'm sure we could talk a little more, but I want to thank you all and for being here with Ethical Perspectives and for your input. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.